Hello and welcome to the Kentucky CDBG Grant Administrator Certification Training. My name is Kate Steger with ICF and I will be your host for this morning. Before we begin, I will be going over a few logistics. The webinar is currently being recorded. As a reminder, all participants are in listen-only mode. However, there are two ways to submit your questions for today. The WebEx toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen will contain the chat box and the Q&A. If you do not see either the chat box or the Q&A, please look to your bottom right hand and please select the three-dot icon and select what are you missing. It will then appear in the panel of your WebEx toolbar. If you're experiencing any technical issues, please submit them through the chat box and please send them directly to the host. I will work with you to resolve those issues. For all content-related questions, please enter them through the Q&A box to all panelists. Your questions will be answered throughout the webinar. I would like to now turn it over to Les to begin our presentation. Les?
Great, thanks, Kate. Hey, Kate, one question for you. I know we're recording these, and I talked with Chantel. We're going to provide folks a link to that. Do you know the status on that?
I will check in on that for us.
Okay, all right, great, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, folks, so day two. Hopefully you got some rest last night and are feeling ready to go again. We've got a lot of ground to cover. We ended yesterday by talking about procurement. Oh, I could turn on my camera, I suppose. So now we're going to start by talking then about the contracting process on this, and then go into things including labor standards. We'll be talking about fair housing, EEO and accessibility requirements. And then the end of the day, the second half of the day, we're going to go through the Uniform Relocation Act and talk about relocation, one-for-one replacement, and we'll then be talking about acquisition anytime you're acquiring a property. So a lot of topics, a lot of information. Before we dive into that, I wanted to see, hopefully some of you did a little bit of review, looking over your notes, looking over the chapter last night. Just wanted to check the chat box and also the Q&A and see if we have any questions that you, as you were looking through that you have. Feel free at any point to put those in the Q&A, and we will jump back into those topics and try to answer your questions for you. I also will mention there was a question yesterday and it looked like a discrepancy in numbers between the handbook and the slide, and it sounds like maybe there were a couple places where we had different numbers in the handbook itself. I'm going to be researching those today, and we'll be back to you today with an answer on that. So,
Good morning,
all
Les.
right. Good morning.
I just wanted to tell everyone, if they'll look in the chat, we spoke about Section 3 training yesterday and getting it posted onto our website. Mr. Sutton has graciously done that, and he has posted the link in the chat.
Excellent, excellent. So don't try to do that while you are preparing for this test, or it will frost your mind a little bit. But that I really do suggest that someone in each of the agencies have gone through that training and kind of be up to speed on Section 3, and then looking out to see how are we prepared for this and implementing Section 3 in our program. So excellent. That's a great source. All right. So I don't see anything else. So I think we're going to go ahead and jump into the material. So we ended the day yesterday talking about procurement and the process of determining that lowest responsive and responsible bidder. And so that's a process we're going through, partly to make sure that we have cost reasonableness, but also that we have the right partner that has the right skills and capacity to be able to complete the project that we are undertaking. So once that process has been completed, and Chapter 5 is a relatively short chapter, but it's also really important. The contracting process is where you kind of lock in all of that really important information of what was agreed to, all the requirements that go along with that and the expectations. That contract becomes the guide for the partners on this, on what the requirements are going to be. But it also then, if unfortunately you have some enforcement issues where you're not getting what you contracted for, that contract is going to be what you're going to be using to be able to enforce that and say, no, this is specifically what you're required to do. It's right here in writing. You agreed to it. And so getting this right becomes really important. All right, so once we've gone through that procurement process, then we're really capturing all of that information within the legal instruments that are used to set in place those contractual obligations. And luckily for you, because this is kind of a risky step on making sure that you do it correctly, DLG has put together sample contracts pretty much for every type of contract that you would need to have in place. And so we're going to be mentioning those as we go along. So DLG is not requiring, particularly because we've got these sample forms that have been carefully vetted by their legal counsel, and you're going to be working with your legal counsel on this. They're not requiring that you submit those contracts to DLG in advance and they review them before they're executed, but they will be looking at those contracts as part of their monitoring, their oversight on this. But grantees are really cautioned to work with your legal counsel. These are, there are sample contract formats for you to use, but every project's a little bit different. And so you need to make sure that in working with your legal counsel that you've captured the things that are specific to that project and that they have been adequately and clearly documented within the contract that you're going to execute. So we have some general provisions that are part of that contract. So in the administrative provisions, it's really laying out who the parties are on this, the effective date, names and addresses, those sorts of things are important as part of that. And then that scope of services is really kind of the all important of what is it that we are paying for. I would think that scope of service is going to come directly out of your bid packet. It might have some tweaks to it depending on if there was something further in detail out of the bid that was issued by the winning bidder on that. But that's going to provide a detailed description of the work that's going to be performed. It might include, specific products that will be used and some references to the performance of those, maybe the specifications on the material. So we really lock in what is it that we have, that we're expecting at the end of the project to see, and how will that perform and operate when that's in place. We're going to be talking, and this would be really important to be clear on, that this method of compensation, the issue here is that it needs to, your contract would include a fee or payment schedule, and it would address things like retainage. Usually we're going to see where some portion of each draw is held back until the end of the project to ensure that if there are issues that need to be addressed, that essentially there's enough money still held by you or the grantee that there's an incentive for that contractor to come back, return, and correct those items. But as part of that, the important thing here is that all contracts that include CDBG funds must have a not to exceed clause. So we need to make sure that we either have a fixed price or we have rates with a not to exceed. So we have clearly set a line on the maximum that would be the expenditure for this contract. So a key thing to make sure that all contracts follow that methodology. Under terms and conditions, these are the terms and conditions with the grantee, and that's going to include things like the scope of the project implementation, schedules would be part of that, method and amount of payments. So it's laying out what all the terms are that will be used as part of that. And then this is the place where the language about making sure that those subsequent contracts that are issued. So if we, DLG is issuing a contract with the grantee then in either having an agreement with a subrecipient or with a contractor will have terms and conditions that need to be passed on to those other parties. So, we talked a little bit about Section 3 yesterday and the fact that we're going to need actions being taken by the contractor to collect and report. So that language that DLG has included in the grantees contract would also then need to be included in the contractor's contract, and it would flow down to subcontractors on that. So depending on the type of contract that we're working with, we have a lot of CDBG requirements that are included in our agreement, our contract, that need to be then passed on to other parties. And so we'll have language specifically here about the flow down of those subsequent contracts and the language that would need to be included. We also have, depending on the project, special conditions that will flow with that. So we're going to be talking next after this section about things like federal labor standards. So we might have a project that was triggering Davis-Bacon wage rates, and as part of our contract, those applicable wage decisions that are going to go with that project would be cited as part of that contract. We talked yesterday about Section 3, and so some of our projects based on, are they exceeding the $200,000 level? Are they either housing construction, housing rehab, or other public construction? So we talked about all of our infrastructure is going to fall within that. That would need to then have the Section 3 language as part of that. And so depending on the project and the type of project, and in some cases the funding levels, those special conditions will vary a bit based on what's involved with that particular project. And then keep in mind that we've got an overlay of applicable laws and requirements. So we've got our CDBG requirements that we talked about yesterday, but also things like 2 CFR Part 200, which are the federal financial circular that cover things like procurement, your financial systems, also your audit requirements. But then we have state and local laws that would apply. And so in some cases, we need to add to that contract and make sure that we cite those applicable laws and requirements that would apply to this particular project on that. So you're not being asked to come up with a contract each time on these. We have, as we mentioned, sample forms. So there's a contract document guide that's posted on the website. So if you look at the landing page for the handbook, you'll see in the attachments there is a link for the contracts document guide, but then also a list of attachments for this chapter. If you're looking at your attachment list of sample contracts, so the calling out for the type of contract that you have, the sample provisions that would need to be included. So for construction contracts, they can't be, we talked so importantly about they can't be cost plus percentage or percentage of construction cost methods. They have to be fixed price or not to exceed language on that. And we need to make sure that a full bound copy of that contract is available on file for review by DLG. So I think Andelin talked about yesterday at the point after the grantee meeting that you are signing and forwarding back, returning back a signed copy of your agreement with DLG, but you also would have on file then all of the contracts that have been executed for that project, and they would be then available. And they need to be bound simply to make sure that we don't lose sections of them over time. We also talked when we went through, just kind of thinking back to yesterday when we went through procurement. You know that we've got 4 different categories of procurement. We've got our small purchases, and we talked about if it's under $50 that you're simply trying to get the best value for the funding, but at $50 up to 30,000, getting some bids, having some documentation of pricing options on that to be able to document that you went for a cost reasonable item on that. When we get into construction, we know that we're going to have a more steps in that process. We're going to be advertising the bids. We're going to have our public bid opening that we talked about. And so all of that information is going to be part of this. But we also talked yesterday about, for our non-construction contracts, we talked about the issuance of either a request for proposal, RFP, or request for qualifications, RFQ. And so for those types of projects, and those are usually professional services, there would be a different kind of contract than we would typically use for construction. And so there is a sample, it's attachment 5.1 and 2 in the list. And again, we can't have cost plus percentage or cost plus as part of that. So those need to be not to exceed or fixed price contracts. All right, so let's talk a little bit about excluded parties. So this needs to be a standard process. So before you would sign that contract, you need to make sure that the party that you're about to execute a contract with is not on the excluded parties list. And so there is a system to be able to do that. So essentially, if we had a contractor that was found to have, done something fraudulent, some kind of serious problem, they would be placed on the excluded parties list, which would make them ineligible for other contracts that included federal dollars. Now, it doesn't happen very often. I will say I had a project in a county where with a Davis-Bacon issue where the contractor essentially issued 2 checks to each of the employees and had them sign over and give back one of the checks, so they continue to pay their regular wages instead of the Davis-Bacon, because that other check, which reflected the difference between their regular salary and Davis-Bacon, was handed back. So pretty big issue. Labor Department did an investigation on this. They were not placed on the excluded parties list. So I have not seen many projects where that action was taken, but the goal is to block those folks who have caused issues from being able to get involved in any further federal funding on that. So our step is going to be to make sure that all of our contractors and subcontractors have been reviewed to make sure they're not on the excluded parties list. And that documentation needs to be in that file for each firm that's been awarded. So there is an online electronic system that allows you to go in, do a search by the name of the company. You would need to print out that search and place that in your file, and that will document that you've completed that that screening, that you've determined that that contractor or subcontractor is not on the excluded parties list, and that information would be placed in your file. If you were to find that you went all the way through the procurement process, you did your search on the excluded parties list and found that they were on that list, you're going to have to start over on your procurement process because you cannot go ahead and finalize that contract because they are not eligible to be able to do that. And I will say this is one of the things that I kind of commonly see that is missing from time to time in files. And it's not clear to me whether it's that the step wasn't done or they simply didn't print out the documentation and hold on to it to be able to document that. So a really important step, something that I would make a note on and be able to answer a question about that perhaps. All right, so let's talk about bonding. So first off, I guess the question might be, what is bonding? What's the purpose of bonding? So bonding is essentially where there's a guarantee in place to back up that bidder. And so we see this in several ways. We could see this with a bid guarantee for a bidder, but we also see a performance bond or a payment bond in place. And so that if we have a project where essentially the contractor walks away from our project, we have a performance bond which will guarantee the funding to be able to complete that project. Payment bond similarly would guarantee the funds to be able to cover the costs of making those payments. Angela? I think you're on mute.
Thanks, Les.
There you go.
Hi, good morning. We had a question in the chat that I think was referring to the excluded parties. So on the last
Okay.
the department
Let's just go back.
application on sam.gov, will the prime contractor do the check for subcontractors, or will the grantee project manager check on the subs?
I'm used to, and I think we'll want to check with Jennifer on this. I'm used to that at the point that the contractor has identified subcontractors, that they would let the grantee know about that. And sometimes you will have, before your contract signing, they would have identified subcontractors and the grantee would go ahead and do that check. But with some projects, we're going to have subcontractors that haven't yet been identified. And so the contractor would be told that once they identify the subcontractors, that they would notify the grantee, and the grantee would need to run that check. Jennifer, is that how you are operating with local grantees on running the SAMS check?
So you're saying that once all subcontractors are identified and they're given to the grant, the list is given to the grantee, then yes, the administrator of that project would need to run the sam.gov check.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that subcontractors that are identified later, the contractor will notify the grantee, and the grantee will do the same process, but be doing it at the point that they're identified?
I would say yes.
Okay, perfect.
All right.
All right.
We have another question that came into the chat a little earlier about procurement. That might have been a question left over from yesterday, so I'm not sure if you want to get to that now or maybe hold it until
Let's go
you're
ahead
done with
and
the
let's
section.
go ahead and deal with it.
Okay, great. When we convened to talk after the session yesterday, our group was still unclear on whether we need 3 quotes or bids or 2 quotes or bids, both instances with clear documentation of outreach and decline to bid quote responses.
I think where we left things, and I think I'll ask Jennifer to join in on this. I believe what we said yesterday was that the goal here is to have 3 bids to represent a competitive environment. And I think, Jennifer, you were saying that if you were in the 2 bid category, that you would want them to confer with you, and that you may well be telling them, no, go back, remarket this, try to get more bidders.
Yes.
Okay. Our goal here is to try to get this, create a competitive environment, which is how we're going to make sure that we are getting essentially the best value for the funds available. And sometimes that's, we talked about sometimes everybody will come in over, or we don't get responses, and having to remarket these, rebid these isn't uncommon. It adds to the timing on this and the effort. So the more that you can do up front to try to, a lot of folks will maintain a list of potential contractors and are sending bids out or sending information out directly to those known contractors, but also doing their advertising on this, trying to make sure that they get as many potential interested parties as possible on these.
Right. I've even followed up on bids as long as you do the same thing for everybody. So you
Yep.
could a day or two before it's due, send just a reminder, but as long as you do the same thing for everybody.
Yeah. I will say one of the things, I did a short stint where I was the development director for a multifamily housing development organization. And one of the things that our construction uh, section head did was he would sit down with bidders who were not successful if they wanted, and kind of walk through their bids and help them understand where they seemed to be higher than other vendors. And the reason he did that was to try to help some of those new bidders figure out how to be competitive, because he wanted to not have them walk away from competing, because we want that competitive environment. So, I mean, there's sort of limited applications of when something like that could be done, but I think it's important to try. If you listen to our Section 3 training, one of the things that we talk about is trying to make sure that when you're explaining things like Section 3 to contractors, that they understand very clearly what their responsibilities are and that it's not overwhelming to them, because particularly in times when you've got a pretty good economy and quite a bit of work that's available for contractors, they sometimes will say, these publicly funded projects have all these strings and rules that are attached and reporting. I think I won't bother bidding on these because I can get other work. So we want to do what we can to help not only have those contractors know when there's a bidding opportunity available, but as much as possible trying to recruit bidders, trying to answer questions and ease some of their concerns about this. And that could be as simple as having a reputation of making timely payments on your projects, so that people are like, it's a good thing to work with these publicly funded projects. And once I start working with them, I know that there's going to be funding coming along for lots of different things in communities. So, all right. Anything else before we move on?
Nope, that's it. Thank you so much.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. So we're talking about bonding requirements, and I would want to either remember these or be able to locate this. So the bonding requirements for bid guarantee, 5% is required for each bidder. Under Kentucky law, so this is KRS, contracts over $100,000 require performance bonds for 100% of the value, and then payment bonds for 100% of the original contract price. And this, the federal bonding requirements are triggered at the same level. So we need to make sure that the bonding requirements are met as part of a bid. So laying that out, clarifying that within your bid documents, and then reviewing to make sure that that is in place will be important as part of that. I know that one of the things that was talked about in Section 3 in trying to get some of these small Section 3 business entities to participate in programs was sometimes they need coaching about how do I get bonding? What are the bonding requirements on that? And so I think it's another example of, if we want a strong bidder pool, our bidders need to understand what those requirements are, and sometimes we might need to provide them some information on that. All right. So let's kind of switch gears and talk about subrecipient agreements. So first off, what's a subrecipient? So if DLG is, let's say, funding a county for a number of CDBG activities, for some of those, that county could in turn then have a subrecipient, which is a public or a private nonprofit entity, administer one or several of those activities on behalf of that grantee. So because they are working on behalf of the grantee, all those rules that apply to the grantee, we talk about, meeting national objective and, determining an eligible activity, but also procurement, environmental review, all these things that go with those funds need to be captured and included in that subrecipient agreement. Now, I also want to clarify, and this is important to understand, is we also have some parties that are functioning somewhat similarly, but are not considered to be a subrecipient. So if we are procuring a contractor, and so we're going to go through procurement, we're going to sign a contract with that entity, and they might be doing administration of a program. They are not considered a subrecipient. As a contractor, they're working on behalf of the grantee. Their contract responsibilities may well be requiring them to implement some of these same requirements that a subrecipient is implementing, but essentially they're becoming a contract employee working on behalf of the grantee, and they are going to be, have a specific scope of work as part of that contract. When we have funding that's going to a homeowner or a landlord for rehabilitation assistance, they're not a subrecipient, they're a beneficiary. They're benefiting I took 3 years of Latin. Bene is good in Latin, so this is giving them a good, they're benefiting from this program, so they're a beneficiary. An entity that receives relocation benefits, again, they are getting some benefits that are due to them under the Uniform Relocation Act, but they are not a subrecipient. They're not administering a program on behalf of the grantee. Similarly, with a business that's getting economic development funding, and in some cases, we might have another division or department within that same unit of government that's going to be administering that grant. So maybe a county is receiving CDBG funds, and they are going to have some of their funding provided to their county health department, who's going to be administering those funds. They are not a separate entity. They are a separate department or division of that grantee, and so they're not considered a sub-recipient. But we oftentimes would see something like a memorandum of agreement that would be issued with them. And I'll just use the example, when I worked at the state level, we passed home funds on to the Housing Finance Agency. And so when they were still officially a part of the state government before they became a quasi entity, we had a MOA with them, which laid out, we're providing you this amount of funding. This is what you're going to do with it. These are the reporting requirements. So sort of similar to what a subrecipient agreement would include, but it's not categorized as a subrecipient because they're still part of that same unit of government that received the funding. So the subrecipient agreement, it's really laying out all of those important requirements of, what's the scope of work for this? What do we expect you to do as far as the records you need to maintain, the reporting back to us that would be part of that. We talked yesterday about program income, and we defined that as any money that's coming back to the grantee or the subrecipient. And so we need that program income language within that subrecipient agreement. And that might be saying, you can hold that money at the subrecipient level. Here are the rules that will apply. It might be saying, anytime you receive program income, it needs to come back to the grantee as part of that, and they're going to be administrating that. So all of those administrative requirements the conditions for religious organizations, which you would see in not only the sample subrecipient requirement, we have similar language in the grant agreement with DLG. And then language about giving the authority to be able to, as needed, to be able to suspend or terminate that contract. And along with that is the reversion of assets, which I'm not really sure why that is bolded here. I don't think that we're trying to make that more important than other things on the list. So I'll give you an example. I had a county years ago that had a subrecipient and they had to terminate the subrecipient. And with the services that were being provided, some CDBG funds had been used to acquire some basic equipment, I think some freezers and other things. They were doing a food distribution program. And so under the reversion of assets, those equipment that were part of the delivery of service were returned to the county. And so when they were seeking to find another organization to be able to provide those services, that those assets that were returned then could be provided to the next subrecipient as part of that. So all the standard contract provisions, program requirements, and then rules about disposition of things like equipment would need to be included in that. There is a template for this, and again, that's sort of your safe harbor to use the subrecipient agreement, work with your legal counsel, add or make edits to that based on the specific project that you're working with to make sure that it's going to be appropriate for you. And so I mentioned in some cases where we don't have a subrecipient, but we have another unit of government, or in some cases we have two units of government working together. I think we see this a lot with our infrastructure projects, where our infrastructure is crossing across a couple of legal boundaries. And so we need to have that intergovernmental agreement, and that could be done where they're either jointly applying together and jointly going to be administering that project, or we could have a cooperative agreement in place where one unit is going to be applying, they're going to get the funding, but that other unit is then going to be owning, operating, or maintaining. And I would recommend working with DLG, making sure that they understand your proposed structure on that, and that's going to be acceptably captured within those cooperative agreements. So one of the last attachments within this chapter is our contract reporting. So DLG is required to file reports on contracting and subcontracting. And so you are then required to submit annually by September 15th, because they have a deadline. They also have to meet by the end of the fiscal year. And that report is on all contracts and subcontracts that were executed during that reporting period. So it's not open contracts, it's new contracts that were executed during that time period. And then if there's no activity, no contracting that's happened, you would issue the form and indicate that, so that DLG is clear that nothing happened, as opposed to I've not yet issued that report. And so that is an attachment for this chapter also. All right, so we're a bit ahead of schedule here. Andolin, do we have any more questions or chats that have come in on the contracting section before we move ahead?
We don't. There was one that was specifically to Jennifer, and Jennifer answered that, recommending that person reach out to DLG. So I think we're good to go.
Perfect. All right. Well, then I'm going to turn things over to you, Andolin, and I'll let you choose when folks need a break.
Great. I think we're running a little bit ahead, so I'm hoping to get through this module. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. All right. So let's go ahead and jump into it. We're going to talk about labor standards and construction management. Now, So federal labor wage and payment laws. So there's the minimum wage requirement, which we should all be familiar with. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on, but in addition to the regular minimum wage requirement, there are two requirements: the Davis-Bacon and the Copeland Anti-Kickback Act. And we're going to go a little further into each of these momentarily, but basically, Davis-Bacon requires that workers receive prevailing wages, and the Copeland Anti-Kickback Act ensures that workers are paid weekly and only permissible deductions. So no unspecified payroll deductions are allowed. And again, we're going to go into that a little bit more in the upcoming slides. All right, so when do these apply? So Davis-Bacon and the Copeland Act applies to all construction activities greater than $2,000. Generally, when you're talking about non-residential, which is much of Kentucky's projects, those are non-residential, and those are where construction costs exceed $2,000. Davis-Bacon and Copeland Act kicks in. If you're talking about residential projects, then that's rehab of more than 8 units, 8 or more units. That's when Davis-Bacon would be triggered there. And some water and sewer extension projects also trigger Davis-Bacon and the Anti-Copeland Act, and you will need to check with DLG specifically on those. Additionally, there is some guidance around the cost of equipment. So when KCDBG funds are used in whole or in part to finance equipment, the applicability of wage rates to the installation costs must be determined. So you're going to have to do an equipment analysis in order to determine that. So that's where all items of equipment are included, along with an explanation of the related costs when it comes to the installation there. And you can contact DLG for assistance with that as well, with making that determination of whether installation costs of equipment is going to trigger Davis-Bacon as well. So things that are demolition only, if there's no construction planned, that's another instance where you'll want to check with DLG to see whether or not Davis-Bacon and the Anti-Copeland Act are going to be applicable there. Copeland Anti-Kickback Act. Sorry, I keep saying that wrong. All right, so overtime, we just talked about this a little bit. There is the Contract Work Hours and Safety Standards Act that requires overtime pay for workers on construction contracts over $100,000 that work more than 40 hours a week. However, there is also state overtime requirements, KRS 337.285, that requires time and a half pay for any hours worked over 40 hours a week. So by both of those standards, if people work over 40 hours a week, then you do have to pay them additional overtime pay. All right, now let's talk about the bid documents and how this all fits in here. So as the grant administrator, you'll want to be sure to include all of the applicable labor standards documents in with your bid package. So all that language should be included in the bid specifications and all of the contract documents. These are things that you need to think about and that the contractor needs to be aware of upfront, particularly because it may change the rate that that contractor will pay some people, which may change the budget, and that definitely needs to be known upfront. All right, and we got a question in the chat for overtime. Are there any daily triggers, or is that just for the span of the week? I believe that it's just for the span of the week. I believe that it's just 40 hours per week. I've not heard of any daily triggers there.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree.
yeah,
And
I
that gives
agree
you
on
some
that.
flexibility.
I know what they're referring to here. Remember, there used to be the 10-hour day. You couldn't work over 10 hours in a day without paying overtime. And that's been kind of rescinded.
yeah,
So that doesn't apply anymore.
great. Thank you so much. All right, good question. Keep them coming, please. Whenever you have a question, feel free to pop that into the Q&A box. All right, so as the grant administrator, you'll want to include all of this information up front. It may affect the budget, and it's important to know up front and the contractor knows. You're going to be responsible for obtaining all the required documentation for monitoring the project in this way, for really monitoring overall project compliance, but right now we're talking about the labor standards part of it and for maintaining the appropriate files. So um, you can access the Davis-Bacon prevailing wage rates at sam.gov. I think that's sam.gov/wage determination. But to ensure accuracy, you should request the applicable federal wage rate decision from DLG. So the way that you would do that is to use attachment 6-1, that's request for determination of wage rate form. It's got to be submitted within at a minimum of 30 days, so at least 30 days in advance of your bid document so that they have time to pull that and get it to you and you have time to put it into all of your documents appropriately. DLG prefers that request to come in an email. Excuse me. Okay, so the federal wage determinations generally come in 4 categories. So there's building, residential, heavy, and highway. Generally, most of case CDBG's construction projects involve either building or heavy determinations, but again, you definitely want to fill out that attachment 6-1 and make sure you get the appropriate wage rate from DLG. But just to go through, it's important that you know what those each stand for. So building construction generally includes constructions of sheltered enclosures with walk-in access. All construction within and including exterior walls, but both below and above grade is generally what building uh, is. Residential, much like it sounds, includes the construction, alteration, or repair of single-family houses or apartment buildings, no more than 4 stories tall. Highway projects include the construction, alteration, or repair of roads, and heavy construction generally for all of the other construction projects that are not classified in one of those other ones. So it's not classified as highway, residential, single family homes or apartments with no more than 4 stories, or building. Then there'll be heavy construction, and generally like water and sewer line constructions are typically heavy constructions as well. All right, so you want to get all of that information, know clearly and know that you have in your file whether it's building, highway, residential, or heavy construction. It says, if applicable, you'll want to request the state prevailing wage rate. Now, the state prevailing wage rate was uh, made no more. I apologize. I'm losing the word here. Was rescinded on January 17th, 2017. So projects that were funded before that would need that state prevailing wage rate, but moving forward and projects that are funded now do not. You definitely want to review and reconcile the rates and make sure that you add all of that information into the bid and contract documents. All right, a pre-construction conference. Not a requirement, but certainly a really, really good idea. Um, uh, Definitely suggested that you have a pre-construction conference, and there's a sample pre-construction conference checklist, attachment 10-22, that you can use. So grantee, the grant administrator, the engineer or architect, any other technical advisors should be at the construction pre-construction conference. And this is where you're going to explain the contractual requirements, go over the performance schedule, make sure everybody is on the same page. You're going to explain to the contractors their responsibility when it comes to labor standards and equal opportunity requirements. There's a list of commonly asked questions concerning equal opportunity. That's attachment 6-5. That should be distributed at the pre-construction conference and discussed there. Um, At this time during the pre-construction conference, you can correct any deficiencies. If you're missing a signature, or, missing a certificate of compliance, then you can clear that up there. You'll want to obtain the contractor's federal identification number. This is the DUNS number that can be gotten from sam.gov, that they can obtain from sam.gov. You'll want to have the contractor complete the contractor employee breakdown form. This is a part of the equal opportunity. It's attachment 6-6. It lists each employee expected to work on the project and breaks it down by demographic, so by race, sex, job classification, and the salary and wage rate. This can also be a useful form later on for the maybe weebies, which I think less discussed yesterday, the women and minority-owned business goals. All right, so other things that you want to talk about during the pre-construction conference include making sure that the contractor knows that they're going to have to submit weekly payrolls and statements of compliance for Davis-Bacon. That the wage must conform with the wage rate determination form that you received from DLG. That employee interviews are going to be conducted during the process, that the grant administrator, you will be coming on site and talking to their workers to conduct those Davis-Bacon employee interviews. Explain the 40 hours per week overtime requirement. And explain that no unspecified payroll deductions can be made. This is a good time to go through all of those things. Also a good time to provide posters, which we're going to talk about in just a moment.
And I will just add to that. I think this is also a great opportunity just for people to put, a face with a name, to know that, okay, if I have a question as we're going through this about Davis-Bacon or really any other aspect of this, just so folks understand not only the expectations, but sort of the making those connections of who's in charge and who do I need to respond to and when, sort of thing. I think sometimes will help resolve issues as they come up as part of this. And frankly, while you are doing, if you were choosing to do a pre-construction conference, I think it helps on the front end to go through these details to avoid then some confusion or delays or other things later. And, particularly when Catherine is talking on tomorrow on Wednesday about environmental review, sometimes you're going to have projects that have some special conditions related to that. We might have with URA that we're going to be talking about this afternoon. There might be some things related to that, or historic, where certain things can't be touched. So I think talking about all those details of the project up front will oftentimes help to avoid some of that confusion. It's not a fail-safe, but it gives you another shot at making sure that, we in the contract portion talked about, well, putting all of this language in about here are all the requirements that you're expected to do, but just putting it in print doesn't always do the trick. So being able to kind of talk about it in the context of this project and how you're going to implement that project sometimes helps.
Absolutely.
We have a question here, which I have an opinion on, but I want to check also with Jennifer. So this person is asking about if they have employees that are Amish or Mennonite, and they're saying therefore exempted from federal taxes. Would you be still required to withhold federal taxes from payroll? I have to say, I grew up in an area with the Amish, one of the highest concentrations. And I guess I'm not aware that, I know that there was an issue about not wanting to pay for defense and military, but my understanding would be they're not exempt and that you would need to follow the withholding of federal taxes. Jennifer, any thoughts on this one?
This is new territory for me. We've not had this occur before, but I know why they're asking, and that's because in our disaster areas, we have a lot of these folks that are out there kicking butt and taking names as far as building houses.
Mm-hmm.
And it's on houses that they're doing the work. So
I'm not aware that they're exempt, and I guess my thought would be you follow the rules. If they are exempt, they could file to have that refunded back to them, but I don't believe that's correct.
I've not ever heard such a thing. All right. We also have a correction. DUNS is no longer used by SAM. It's now the SAM generated UEI, Unique Entity Identifier. That does sound familiar, and thank you so much for that correction. You're absolutely right. Okay, so Les named a couple of things that are specific, going to be very project specific in the pre-construction conference, and that was a really good point that leads to the next point, which is make sure you take minutes and document the file. Again, like I said yesterday, if it's not documented, it didn't happen, but the minutes are really for review as well. The contractor or the grant administrator can go back and make sure that you covered a certain thing just to feel comfortable that the contractor should know, or you can go back and reference that later, any questions that were asked. So make sure you take minutes and document the file for the pre-construction conference. All right, so the notice to proceed after execution of the contract and the pre-construction contract, the project really starts when you're issue that notice to proceed. That is the notice to the contractor that they can go ahead and get started. So the notice to proceed should include the name of the contractor, the amount of the contract, the construction period, the completion dates, the basis for assessing damages if work is not completed in accordance with that contract timeline. There's a sample notice to proceed provided at attachment 6-9 in the CDBG handbook, KCDBG handbook. And then keep in mind that you also have to send that notice to proceed, excuse me, to DLG for their files after it's executed. So the notice to proceed is a really important part of the project. All right, a few minutes ago, I mentioned some posters. So during the pre-construction conference, a really good time to go ahead and provide these posters. At the City of Columbia, we used to print them and laminate them for our contractors. You can also send them in a electronic file. I don't know if Kentucky has any preference on that, but I've seen people send them in electronic files and require that the contractor print them and laminate them as well. They want to be, they should be laminated because they'll be outside and should hold up against the elements. They may be outside. So a couple of the posters include the Davis-Bacon Act poster. There's a notice to all employees working on federal or federally financed construction projects as well. There's the health and safety protection, safety and health protection on the job poster, and the equal opportunity employment is the law poster as well. And each of these give just a little bit of really important information to the employees about their rights. And so should be posted in a conspicuous place on the job site. You as the grant administrator, when you visit the job site, maybe to do Davis-Bacon interviews, will be looking for the posters, take photos of the posters actually posted on the job site and put that in the file is a really good best practice as well. But you definitely want to inform the contractor that it is their responsibility to only employ eligible subcontractors who have certified eligibility in a written subcontract containing the federal labor standards and the equal opportunity employment provisions. So those should be in any contracts and also in the subcontracts. All right, so labor standards, payroll review. Now we're getting into Davis-Bacon a little bit more. So there are weekly payrolls that the contractor will provide to the grant administrator, and these should be reviewed by the grantee upon receipt. That way, any necessary corrective action can be initiated before the problem multiplies. I have seen this with a project that I was working on, but wasn't the Davis-Bacon coordinator. But the Davis-Bacon coordinator did not review those payrolls and let about 6 of them pile up. And there was a problem from the very first one. And going back and getting folks, and especially after 6 weeks, a phase of the project is likely over, and the folks who maybe were working on that phase maybe are not working on the project anymore. So to go and track them down and is a really big hassle. So it's really important that those payrolls are being reviewed when they are received. Payroll forms must be initialed by the grantee to indicate that they have been reviewed. Some things that you want to look for when you're reviewing those payrolls are the correct classification of the workers. You want to compare the classification and the wage determination rate. So the prevailing wage rate will have the job classification and the wage that should be paid for that job classification. And you want to make sure that the person who is in that job classification is being paid at least the rate equal to what's on the wage determination form. You want to ensure that work by the employee in excess of 40 hours a week is being paid no less than time and a half. You want to review to make sure there's no unspecified payroll deductions on there. Um, you want to make sure that a statement of compliance has been completed and signed by the owner or officer of the firm. That's attachment 6-11 in the KCDBG handbook. That's a really important part too, that make sure that statement of compliance is in there and correct and signed by the appropriate person. If there are any discrepancies, then you want to report those to DLG and take steps to resolve those discrepancies. If there are underpayments of wages, then there is a way to correct that. And I believe that we're going to talk about that in the next couple of slides. But if there is an underpayment of wages, then the grantee is responsible to make sure that the correct wages are paid and that the employer, the employer is responsible to pay wage restitution to the affected employees. All right, so Uh, part of Davis-Bacon is the payroll forms. Part of Davis-Bacon, the other part is the interviews, and these two kind of go hand in hand. Um, the interviews should back up what's on the payroll form. So you should conduct job site interviews. There is a record of employee interview form. That's attachment 6-12 in the handbook. There's also that same form in Spanish. You'll want to make sure that you interview at least 10% of the workers on site and at least one worker in each job classification. So if there are painters, then at least one of the painters on the job site. If there are laborers, at least one of the laborers on the job site. Um, you should ensure that the interviews are conducted at least once during each phase of the project. And that's what I meant. Once those phases are over, they're over and workers tend to move on. Make sure that you are there during at least once during every phase of the project. I used to get at the beginning a schedule during the pre-construction conference, a schedule of the work and what would be completed at what phase. So I could plan in the very beginning what days I was going to go out, and as long as construction wasn't too fast or too slow, it pretty much stayed on track there. So you want to make sure that payrolls are being used to verify what's said during the interviews. And I said that a little bit earlier. You're going to compare these two and make sure that they sync up. Check to make sure that employees are paid the amount of the wage rate, um, and that if there are any hours over 40, that they're being paid time and a half for that. Identification and correction of any discrepancies between the interviews, the payrolls, and the wage rates is a really big part of Davis-Bacon, and you're just going to want to make sure that you figure out how to sync all of those up and make sure that they're all backing each other up and telling a complete story. A fully completed and signed record of employee interviews should be maintained in that file. So again, if it's not documented, it didn't happen, make sure that you keep each of those employee interviews in the file. I would connect the employee interviews to the payrolls for that week, and make sure that it read like a book. So in my files, the interviews for that week and the payrolls were always together. All right.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in here and make an observation that I see throughout the interview versus the payroll process. That a lot of times you'll have the person that goes out and does the interview, they might sign off on that interview form, stating that they did it. But at the bottom where it says payroll reviewer, that I don't know if they totally skip that step or they just don't sign that document. And I'm not, or also don't always see where it's been in the payroll itself has been initial showing who reviewed. So just want to pull those little finding issues out there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yep. Very important that that it's initialed and signed appropriately to make sure that it's documented, that it's been reviewed.
And I think the point on that is that these go hand in hand, that you're looking for the real world verification of, what you're seeing in print. And
Right.
so that's why it's so important.
Exactly. All right. So when you go out to do the interviews, you're going to make sure, conduct those interviews on site if at all possible, as long as it's safe, and privately. So this is a one-on-one process. You don't want the um, employee's supervisor or manager to be standing right there. You want them to be able to speak freely. Um, the employer, you should go ahead and look for those signs. Like I said before, take photos of the signs, make sure those are in the file as well. Take a few minutes to observe the duties and the tools that the worker is using before you begin the interview. Some of the interview questions or the questions on that interview form are going to include the employee's full name, their permanent mailing address, the last date the employee worked on the project, and the number of hours that they worked. Um, Make clear that these questions are solely related to this project, not any other work that they're doing for that company. You'll also find out the employee's hourly rate of pay. And so the goal is to determine if the worker is being paid at least the minimum prevailing wage rate. You'll want to ask to make sure that the worker doesn't have any questions or complaints. This might be a good time to help them. They might not know how to make a complaint, and you want to make sure that they are um, uh, all of their questions are being answered. I mentioned before that the Spanish version of this is available. The record of employee interview form is attachment 6-12, and there is one in Spanish as well. So again, comparing the interview forms to the payroll and signing forms, making sure that like Les said, the real world interview backs up what's on the payroll form. And you'll need to resolve any issues with the prime contractor, work with them if there are any issues that arise. So we got a question in the chat here. Does the grantee need to do the interviews and payroll reviews, or can this be completed by the subrecipient? So I'm going to let Les and Jennifer answer this, but I do believe that the grantee, the grant administrator, needs to do that. It's a part of the monitoring and making sure that that it's being done correctly. Les?
I would think that that's normally the case unless I suppose we had a grantee who said, I want to take responsibility for that. I don't know, Jennifer, do we have any situations where it's not the grant administrator who's
It
doing
is
those
usually
interviews?
the grant administrator because that is part of their contract.
Yeah.
To do that.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for that question in the Q&A box. All right, let's go on to other labor compliance items. So if there are errors on the payroll, and we talked about this a little bit ago, and I said that there are errors, we're going to go into how to correct those. So if there are errors on the payrolls, then you need to get the corrected payrolls and statements of compliance. So there's a correction payroll that is a thing. It's another payroll that you'll do that will be deemed a correction payroll. It's going to reflect the period of time for which restitution is due. If someone was found to have been paid lower than the prevailing wage rate, this is how you fix that. So the corrected payroll will list each employee that is due restitution and their work classification, the total number of hours that they worked, and the adjustment wage rate. And that's the difference between the required wage rate and what was paid. So just it's going to list the adjustment there. That'll give you a gross amount of restitution. It will list any deductions, making sure, of course, that those are standard deductions. And then it will list out the net amount to be paid for this restitution. There's a properly signed statement of compliance that's got to be um, connected to, attached to that certified payroll. And that's how you go about ensuring the restitution. Um, if workers can't be found, which sometimes happens, the contractor must escrow the funds, but hopefully the workers can be found, and you can get them that restitution. Again, complete forms and reports. All of this documentation must be in file. This is something that happens sometimes. We hope that it doesn't happen a lot, um, but it is very important to correct those wage determinations when you find or if you find an error. So the contract administrator is going to review that correction payroll to ensure that the full restitution was paid. The prime contractor will be notified of any discrepancies. And additional payments must be documented within 30 days. So additional payments must be documented on that supplemental correction payroll within 30 days if there are additional errors found. All right, so we've talked a little bit about Davis-Bacon, about the Copeland anti-kickback law. Now let's get into equal employment opportunity. So all the bid and contract documents must ensure equal opportunity requirements and must establish procedures for monitoring compliance during the project execution. So that's all going to be a part of the bid documents. So there is an attachment 6-6. That's the contractor employee breakdown form. I know I mentioned this one earlier. It's going to list each employee that's expected to work on the project and give that demographic information. So you need to get the contractor employee breakdown form. Again, attachment 6-6. You'll want to visit the site to check for the required signage that we've been talking about. Again, take pictures and make sure that's in the file. And you want to document monitoring with the equal opportunity compliance in the files. I keep saying if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. So remember the protected classes. We're going to go into all of that in just a little bit when we talk about fair housing in the next module. All right, so oops, let me move the slide here. All right, so review and payments. So upon agreement of the quantities of work completed. So you'll agree at the beginning to pay funds on the project at certain intervals. So when those intervals are reached, you as the grant administrator must do inspections prior to paying out the funds at that interval. So inspection reports, copies of field measurement notes, test results, are used to verify the contractor's periodic payment estimate for partial payments leading up to completion of the project. So when you get those partial payment requests from the contractor, it's your job to check equal opportunity and labor standards compliance. So you're checking again to make sure that the weekly payrolls and statements of compliance have been received, reviewed, and any discrepancies have been resolved. You're checking to make sure that those employee interviews have been conducted, that they've been checked against the payroll and wage rates, and any discrepancies have again been resolved. You're checking to make sure those posters are up. And you're checking to make sure you have that contractor employee breakdown form. Um, and Les discussed this earlier in detail. Many grantees do find it helpful to keep that 10% retainage until after final inspection, and we'll go through that in a little bit as well. A little bit more about that as well. Okay, let's talk about change orders. Things happen. Change orders happen. Hope that they'll be at a minimum, but they do happen. So when change orders do um, happen, are submitted, they must be accompanied by a supporting statement that describes why the change is necessary. They have to be backed up by cost estimates and any needed plans or specs that might be needed at that time. The grant administrator must approve and authorize change orders before they're given to the contractor. Change orders should be kept at a minimum, as I said, and cannot be issued after the final payment. So if the cumulative cost of the change orders is not going to exceed 20% of the original contract price, and the changes don't constitute a major alteration of the scope of work, then they're acceptable. If the proposed change orders cumulatively over the whole project are going to exceed 20% of that original contract price or are going to change the scope of the project, then DLG must be consulted prior to approval of any of the change orders. That's an important point there. So if all of the change orders cumulatively over the life of the project are going to exceed a 20% change in the original contract price, or are going to change the scope of the project, then the grantee must contact DLG for prior approval. So an example of a change order. Uh, if at the beginning of a project, the cost of wood was one thing, and then, for example, there's a pandemic, right? We saw the cost of building materials pretty much skyrocket, or a more common one, maybe not a pandemic, but something happens with the economy, and the price of wood has gone up tremendously, and we need a change order. That's a good example of a change order. Um, if the price of the products that you need to build have gone up, then you might need a change order in order to get the funds for that. Les, can you think of another example of a change order?
Well, I mean, sometimes you have where there's a discovery that the scope of work was not adequate to cover something. So, I mean, I've had cases where, like, the fire marshal came back in and said, "Oh, this building will need to have a sprinkler system," or you know, things like that, where there's for some reason or another, or maybe, you know, when we do like rehab, we sometimes open something up and discover, oh, there's a bigger problem than we realized. If we see many change orders, particularly on something that's rehab, we begin to then question, um, is it that they haven't done an adequate inspection on the front end? Is it sometimes you will have a contractor who has, you know, bid low to try to get the job and then kind of realized at some point, I'm not going to make very much money, so then tries to execute a series of change orders on this. So, I mean, change orders aren't 100% avoidable, but they need to be kind of scrutinized.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Les. And Les made a very good point. That's something that that HUD definitely looks out for. If there are a number of change orders sometimes people bid low on purpose, and that should be something that you look out for and is avoided.
And sometimes on
Apologize.
projects, and I don't know, since we're not doing a lot of rehab under this program, although some of you, if you are receiving CDBG DR funding, might be doing some projects that are doing rehab that, you may have not done a lot of that in the past. One of the techniques that's sometimes used is to include in a bid that, for instance, like if we were doing a roof and we do the tear off and we discover that the underlayment is more rotted than we had believed, that bid could include a cost per linear foot or whatever for this as part of that bid, so that there's already a specification for that, and there's essentially dollars that are available for that. So, I mean, generally the technique is to try to make sure that you have really thorough scope of work. And that's why, we talked about having a certified engineer or an architect that's signing off on plans. If we were talking about rehabilitation, trying to get as detailed of an inspection as possible. And frankly, that's one of the reasons we talked about sometimes having to do an addenda to that bid packet, that sometimes you'll have one of the bidders who will visit the site, look at that, and ask a specific question about, they're identifying something they think is going to be a problem. And sometimes that's when you, as the grantee, look at that, determine, yeah, that's probably a legitimate issue, and we need to add that to our specifications, and that addenda is done.
Okay, thank you so much. We got another question. Is there any leniency with this if there's another event such as COVID? If not, will the project be put on hold or funding be refunded? Um, so it's what and Les and Jennifer are welcome to chime in here, but um, if a change order is going to exceed the 20%, then you have to contact DLG, and that's what I'm saying. If there were another event like that, then you'd have to contact DLG, and they would handle that at that time. So,
And actually, it can go other ways. I had a project that when they bid out, this was a large scale multifamily development. When they bid out the original, I think the lumber bid, it was shortly after, I think, one of the big hurricanes. And so the price for lumber was really high at that point, or what they were projecting. And then when they got ready to do the actual contracting, they found that prices had dropped. And so they contacted me and said, okay, we either can return money, or we have enough space on this site, we could build a couple more units. And so we made a change to that scope of work and actually built more units with the monies that have been allocated for that. So, we're trying to make sure that those changes are legitimate, that the pricing on it is appropriate. I think there's always some analytical on, is this something that could have been avoided? And then making sure written agreements, environmental review, if we're doing a change order that changes that scope of work, it could also change the environmental review. So we're just trying to capture all of that information, and that change order is one of the processes to do that.
all right. Thank you so much. And thank you guys for your questions. Okay, let's talk about final payments. All right, so this occurs when the contractor certifies completion. They request their final payment. As the grantee, grant administrator, you're going to conduct a final inspection. You're going to ensure that total compliance with labor laws, equal opportunity, and other requirements are met before paying that final payment. And the final payment in this case does not include the 10% retainage. We're still holding back 10% retainage when we make that final payment. But you're going to check to ensure before we make that final payment that, and I keep saying the same thing kind of over and over again because these are the things that you're checking for here. So all weekly payrolls and statements of compliance have been reviewed, and if there are any discrepancies, that those have been taken care of, that any underpayments of wages or liquidated damages have been appropriately handled, that any discrepancies with those interviews have been handled, have been reviewed and reconciled, that all the required equal opportunity and labor standard provisions that we've talked about this morning have been satisfied. These are all things you want to make sure of before you make that final payment. You're still keeping the retainage here, and I'm going to get to why in a moment. You want to make sure that all the contract submissions have been required. All of the files are complete back at your office. Make sure that you have everything you need. Make sure that any claims or disputes against the contractor have been resolved. That's a big one, and one that I ran into personally one time and came back to bite me. So if the contractor has disputes against them, if there are liens made on the property for any reason, make sure that all of that has been resolved. If the inspection's satisfactory, then you can go ahead and issue that final payment, but you're still holding the 10% retainage. And the reason is within 30 days of filing the acceptance of work and upon a clear lien certificate, that's what you're looking for, a clear lien certificate by the contractor, the grantee, then you'll release the 10% retainage. And at that point you're done. But you want to always hold that 10% retainage until you get that acceptance of work and submission of clear lien certificate. Okay. All right, documentation, and then we'll take a little break here. I know it's been a morning so far. So documentation, you must document that the oversight actions, all the actions that you've taken in your oversight and monitoring, all of your due diligence. You want to make sure that you document, and make sure that it reads like a book, that your file reads like a book. There is an construction oversight checklist, attachment 6-14, that will give you a really good list of all the documents. Other forms, use those as applicable. And just to kind of run through it again, I'm going to go through kind of a long list here. Of things that you need to make sure that you check for, okay? So the wage decisions, the tear sheets for all the bid advertisements, copies of all your bid responses, minutes from your bid opening, verification of contractor eligibility and the debarment clearance, that there's no debarment. You'll want to make sure that you have your notice of award, the executed construction contract, the pre-construction conference report, those minutes that we talked about, the notice to proceed, make sure all of this is in your file. Excuse me, the contractor employee breakdown report for the equal opportunity, employment opportunity, the weekly payrolls, the statements of compliance that accompany those weekly payrolls. Make sure that you have evidence that the payrolls were reviewed. Make sure that they're signed and initialed in the correct places. That's really important. Make sure that you have those employee interviews and the site visit reports, photos of the posters that we've talked about, any engineering inspection reports. Evidence that the on-site interviews were checked against the payrolls and against the Davis-Bacon wage rates. Evidence of any restitution or resolution of any discrepancies. Make sure all of that's in the file. If there are any complaints from any of the workers, make sure that the complaints, along with the resolution of the complaints, are in the file and also sent to DLG. Any liquidated damages assessed, notice of completion and final inspection, the construction oversight checklist. That's a good list of many of the things that need to be in the file. There are more if you look in the handbook, but that is a really comprehensive list of things that you need to make sure are documented before you close out this project. We got a question in the chat. What is a clear lien certificate? So sometimes liens can be made against the contractor, and you want to make sure that there are no more liens. Les, I'm not sure if this is one document that I'm here in South Carolina. This would be, I think, issued by the Department of Labor here in South Carolina, but I'm not sure. Les, can you jump in here?
I think standardly as part of the final payment that there would be a certification by the contractor that they had released all workman liens on the site. So I don't know, Jennifer, do you want to add on this one?
I concur with you. I mean, it's to say, that all work is done, it's been completed, all the contractors have been paid, everything's good there, so they don't hold a lien against the construction project or the grantee.
Because it's a tool for the contractor to be able to essentially force payment by filing a lien on the property. And we sometimes see that when people try to wiggle out of paying part of the work or whatever. And that so that is something that we need to make sure that those have been cleared.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right, so we have reached the end of this module, and I think it's time for a little break. Les, do you want to do, maybe it's 10 o'clock, it's 9:59 now. Are we doing a 10-minute break?
Let's do 15.
Great.
So be back at 10:15. Thanks.
Back at 10:15. Thanks, guys. All right, guys. Hope everyone had a good break, and welcome back. We're going to go straight into fair housing and equal opportunity now. All right. So fair housing, there are a number of laws that oversee fair housing. I'll kind of go through them a little bit now, and then we'll dig deeper in just over the next couple of slides. So there's the Title VI Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's a federal law that prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. Then there's the Fair Housing Act that adds a few more of those protected classes that protects race, color, national origin, religion, sex to include gender identity and sexual orientation, familial status, and disability. And that covers people who are renting a home, buying a home, getting a mortgage, seeking housing assistance, or engaged in other housing related activities. Also includes, I'm not sure if I said homeowners insurance is included on under the Fair Housing Act. Section 106 of the Housing and Community Development Act provides for home ownership counseling notification by creditors to eligible homeowners. Section 109 prohibits discrimination based on the protected classes within CDBG. The Age Discrimination in Employment Act forbids age discrimination for people who are 40 years or older. Section 504 is a federal law that prohibits discrimination based on disability in federally assisted programs or activities. The Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972 protects when it comes to employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national orientation. An Executive Order 11246 prohibits federal contractors and federally assisted construction contractors or subcontractors who do over $10,000 in government business in 1 year from discriminating in employment decisions on the basis of those protected classes. So just kind of wanted to give you an overview of each of these laws, and now we'll dig in a little further here. So I mentioned protected classes a moment ago. And the protected classes, again, are race, ethnicity, color, religion, sex, and that again includes gender identification, um, disability, familial status, and national origin. And those are the protected classes. So you're going to want to take a look at everything you do kind of with an eye to those protected classes and make sure that there's no discrimination or exclusion of any of those protected classes from any of the projects and activities that you undertake. So CDBG regs and executive order 11246 extended protections people concerning sexual orientation and gender identity. Those are a little bit newer, so I wanted to call those out in particular. All right, so limited English proficiency. Um, Title VI bans discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin. This includes the failure to ensure that those who have limited English proficiency can effectively participate in or benefit from the programs. So there's a four-factor analysis and plan, and DLG has done one of these four-factor analyses. Grantees are also required to do their four-factor analysis, and that includes looking at the number of people who have limited English proficiency, who are going to be served by or who are going to encounter the program, the frequency with which those individuals come into contact with the grantees, the nature and importance of the program, activity, or service provided by the program, and the resources available to the recipient and the cost. You're going to look at those four things to kind of create this language, the LAP, I forget, language access plan. So DLG again has created their language access plan, and that just serves as a guide for determining which language assistance measures DLG will undertake to guarantee that folks with limited English proficiency have access to the programs. So you can follow DLG's language access plan, but you can also you must also make sure that the language access plan that you use addresses your local needs as far as limited English proficiency. There's a really helpful chart on page 7-8 of the KCDBG handbook that actually shows a chart with these four analysis, the four factors, and outlines the measures. Kind of gives you an idea of how to do that four-factor analysis. All right, so fair housing requirements apply to the locality as a whole. So not just the project, but you as a grant administrator, this applies to your whole locality and everything that you're doing. And your goals are to maximize housing choice, to lessen racial, ethnic, and economic concentrations of housing. These are called recaps and ECAPs, ethnic concentrations, and racial and ethnic concentrations. Your other goals are to facilitate desegregation, and racially exclusive patterns of occupancy in public facilities. You want to ensure that everything is racially inclusive, and you want to affirmatively further fair housing. So there's one thing to say, yeah, we're going to make sure that nobody is discriminated against, but there's another thing to say, we're going to affirmatively go out and make sure that people know their rights and that people know how to make complaints and that they're not being discriminated against. So what you're required to do is to affirmatively further fair housing.
I would just add, you know, and for some of the communities that we're working with the state program, we may not have a very ethnically diverse community, but I will note that, you know, this issue about lessening racial, ethnic, and economic concentrations of housing has gotten a lot more attention in the last number of years, and there have been actions taken against grantees in how they were allocating their money and how they were choosing to invest their funding. So it is something that needs to be as part of your thoughts on how are you making decisions about, with the funds that you have available to you, where those are being reinvested. And we had where we have seen some legal action taken in recent years, whereas folks were making choices about when they were going to create new housing units versus doing rehabilitation. And the lawsuit had to do with the fact that they were reinvesting in areas that were sort of pockets of racial and economic concentrations instead of expanding opportunities and choices. And so you do need to think about, as you are um, looking at the proposed projects for your communities, how you are you are passing a fair housing resolution for your community. And it's not just that you are passing a resolution, that's the end of your responsibilities, that's part of how you are approaching, and that's being used as part of your decision-making process as you decide where to focus your efforts and use the funds that might be available.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. All right. So fair housing and accessibility, as grant administrators, you want to make sure that all of your programs and projects are free from discrimination. So again, going back through your documentation and your requirements with an eye for each of those protected classes, and making sure that no one is falling through the cracks or being discriminated against. Make sure that the fair housing and equal opportunity um, uh, posters, equal employment opportunity posters are in prominent places, are displayed in prominent locations, particularly even around your office. And you can get those. I think they're free. They used to be free from the FHEO website. Um, at the City of Columbia, we would have them in the different languages according to who spoke that language. So if you walked into my office, you would see one in English and one in Spanish. And if you walked into someone else's office and maybe they spoke a different language, were fluent, then you would see those languages. But that's just a little thing that we did, so that people who walked in off the street kind of knew where they could go for to get someone to translate to who spoke their language. Um, you want to make sure that you're taking affirmative action to overcome previous discrimination. So again, we talked about what that affirmative means and not just sitting back, but being proactive. You want to complete the title, it's called the Civil Rights Title VI Self Survey. And there's an example of that in the KCDBG handbook. There is one of those surveys. Um, that ask questions like, are the posters displayed and are your policies and procedures up to date? And so that's a really good survey to take to kind of see where you're at with your fair housing and accessibility and make sure that you are doing the best that you can there. You also want to use the equal employment opportunity checklist and adoption of procedures. Again, in the KCDBG handbook, which is amazing and has so many great resources. You'll want to look those up and make sure that you're using those. All right, required fair housing activities. So grantees are required to designate a fair housing and equal opportunity coordinator to be the prime liaison with DLG. And this coordinator will review the plans and activities for compliance and suggest strategies and actions to make sure that you are in compliance there. Grantees are required to pass a fair housing resolution as part of the evidentiary materials prior to release of grant funds. At the City of Columbia, we did a fair housing resolution every April because that's Fair Housing Month and it was a good time to do it. And we held things like job fairs and other activities throughout the year, but particularly focused on April. We really made Fair Housing Month a big deal and got people from the community involved. So um, in addition to passing the fair housing resolution and publishing that in the newspapers and posting it in prominent locations, you must undertake one or more fair housing activities annually. And so some of those housing activities could include um, counseling services, marketing the fair housing resolution, like I gave the example in April. We kind of really marketed that and made it a thing. We had a fair housing cookout in the parking lot of our um, building every April, and really giving people resources on fair housing and making sure that they knew their rights. You could create a human rights commission One thing that we did at the city as well, we had a group made up of one person representing each of the protected classes. So someone who, for example, from the local Latino organization or the NAACP to represent race, someone to represent disabilities, um, maybe more than one person, but uh, our commission was made up of people made sure that each protected class was covered, so that when they were reviewing documents or procedures or things that we were doing, they each had an eye for what their group needed, and that was really, really helpful to us. Other ideas of activities that you could do or educational programs, use of HUD's affirmative marketing plans. Those are online and are good. Good to do to use. You could provide assistance to fair housing groups, um, and advertise the benefits of fair housing and make sure that everybody knows their rights. So those are some of the activities that you can do. So again, must pass the fair housing resolution, publish that in the newspaper, put it on the website. If you do, take screenshots, make sure that you're keeping all of this information as documentation, photos if you have a cookout or an event to make sure that people know their rights, make sure that you're documenting all of that. Um, yeah, and those are required fair housing activities. All right. So other fair housing activities, as the grant administrator, you definitely want to review the state's analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. So that's called an AI that identifies the impediments and actions that can be taken in Kentucky to minimize any impediments to fair housing choice. Design marketing campaigns to reach those who are less likely to apply. And there are other examples in the handbook, but I want to give you another example of something we did at the City of Columbia. We used our analysis of impediments. There ended up being 7 impediments in the City of Columbia. And so what we did was created a program called Speak Out, a conversation on fair housing. And we held these quarterly conversations where we invited council people, of course, the public, um, the mayor attended often, and we made it really nice. There was food, there was music, but we sat down for a conversation around fair housing where we addressed 1 to 2 of those 7 impediments at each conversation. So at the beginning of the year, everybody knew which impediments we were going to discuss at which quarterly conversation, so they could plan if they wanted to attend this one or that one and have those conversations. They knew at the beginning of the year when those would be. Um, and we had these quarterly conversations, and we came up with great ideas and things to do to make sure that everybody knew and could we were minimizing the impediments of the fair housing choice. So those are ways that you can take the impediments and really put them into action, and make sure that you're tackling each of those.
And I would just mention, we still have, at least I recall seeing this in Ohio, we still have a lot of particularly rural communities where there are still physical impediments that have not been addressed. And so I do think, again, thinking about public buildings where the public needs to be able to access, and that includes when you think about where services are being provided. In some cases, we have CDBG funds that are being used for public service activities, and they are being completed in structures that are not accessible. So keep that in mind as you look at that analysis of impediments. And that's been one of the criticisms that has been kind of put against this, is that we have communities with an analysis of impediments that has included for many years non-accessible public structures, and nothing has been done as part of planning on how you're going to deal with that. And that would include, we still have CDBG programs where the intake office is on the second floor of a non-elevator building. And so thinking about, how are we operating our program what are the accessibility, and we've had folks that are saying, well, with a client, an applicant that can't get to our office, we will come to them. I think that's a short-term fix, but the goal of the analysis of impediments is to then plan on how we actually will eliminate those as opposed to just work around them. So keep that in mind as part of the process.
Absolutely. Thank you, Les. And we're going to get into some of those things in just a moment as well. So if you as a grantee have your own analysis to impediments, fair housing choice, if you have your own AI, then you can use that AI. But some really important things to do, make sure that there are posters posted at all CDBG funded programs and facilities. Make sure that your legal documents, have been reviewed with an eye towards fair housing. In fact, make sure all documents have the fair housing language and logos on them. Be alert for situations where potential fair housing and non-discrimination may occur. Okay. All right, so accessibility. We're getting into what Les was talking about a little bit more here, but the Fair Housing Act also requires accessible public and common areas, doors wide enough to allow wheelchair access, and adaptable design. So design where it could be reasonably modified for people with disabilities. So you'll want to conduct meetings and program-related marketing and other activities in accessible locations. I think Les just said that. House program intake offices should be in accessible locations. And again, yes, saying that you'll go visit someone rather than them being able to come to your office is a short-term fix. The goal is, you know, equality and for everyone to be able to move in the same ways. So ensure program-related communications are accessible to people with disabilities. Um, if you're doing housing units, distribute accessible units throughout the projects and site, so not all just in one location. Make them available in a sufficient range of size. Make sure that the amenities are comparable to those that are not accessible. Um, Make accessible units available to folks with disabilities first. Make reasonable accommodations to people living with disabilities. So those include a change, adaptation, or modification of a policy, a program, a service, or a workplace that allows a qualified person with a disability to fully participate and take advantage of that service or program, or to fully be able to perform a job. So what's reasonable is generally on a case by case basis, but there are some really good examples of situations and the reasonable accommodations that took place in the KCDBG handbook. So I would say refer to that if you want to get an idea of what is reasonable or not reasonable with an accommodation. All right, Section 504, we mentioned this earlier, and this is specific to people living with disabilities. Um, so it's unlimited and unlawful to discriminate based on a disability, and this includes mobility disabilities, visual, hearing, and cognitive disabilities. So there is a sample 504 checklist you'll definitely want to use, and a self-evaluation and transition plan. That's required as part of the evidentiary materials that I talked about yesterday for a project. That plan includes things like identifying any physical obstacles that are in your facilities or in the facilities that might limit accessibility, physical accessibility. Um, a description of the method that will be used to make these facilities accessible. Um, that plan, the self-evaluation and transition plan, will specify a schedule to achieve full program compliance. And if that plan is longer than 1 year, if it's going to take longer than 1 year to get these facilities up to um, uh, 504 specs or codes, then identify the steps that will be taken each year in order to make sure that you're working towards that goal. That plan will indicate the person responsible for implementing the plan, and any people or group who had input on creating this plan. There is a transition plan attachment 7-6 that'll help you through creating and completing that transition plan. So a grantee is not necessarily required to make every part of an existing facility accessible if it's not structurally possible. Sometimes there are, for example, historic factors where you can't mess with the facade or the front of a building. In that case, you could put a ramp, on the side or in another location. Um, Grantees must address how people with disabilities will be assured access. If there is a reason why it's not feasible to upgrade that facility, then you still have to make sure that there's a way that people can be assured access. The transition plan must involve people with disabilities or representative organizations, and it has to be sent to DLG as part of the evidentiary materials, again, that we talked about yesterday. So I said this a little bit before, I'm going to say it again. You really want to review your projects and programs with an eye towards compliance, go through each of the protected classes and make sure that there's nothing in your policies and procedures that's inadvertently excluding someone or discriminating against someone. Modify those plans as necessary. All right, so section 504, again, people with disabilities, it requires program accessibility. So this includes office space, this includes for housing, there's a certain number of units, and we're going to go into that in a moment. It requires accessible communications and physical accessibility in housing. So the numbers that I just referenced when it comes to housing. So for newly constructed multifamily housing containing 5 or more units, or for substantial rehab, and substantial rehab is where 75% the rehab costs are 75% or more of the replacement costs of that building. So that's substantial rehab. If costs for the rehab are 75% or more of the replacement cost of the complete facility, then it's considered substantial rehab. Okay, so for newly constructed multifamily units, 5 or more, or for substantial rehab of multifamily rental units with 15 or more units, a minimum of 5% of the total dwelling units, but no fewer than one, must be made accessible for individuals with mobility impairments. This is really important. A minimum of 5% of the total dwelling units, but no fewer than one, must be made accessible for individuals with mobility impairments. An additional 2% of dwelling units, again, but not less than one, must be made accessible for people with hearing or vision impairments. There are certain doorbells that light up rather than well, they have the sound, but they also light up for people who are hearing impaired. So things like that must be included in those units for people with hearing or vision impairments. Units that are made accessible must be on an accessible route. You don't want to make a unit accessible, but people can't get to it. Yeah. Okay, and so that's the important thing to note here. 5% of those units need to be accessible for persons with mobility impairments, and an additional 2% for people with hearing and vision impairments.
And I'll just note on that as part of that, so that there's a front end function of that on, as you're approving something, that it include that, but that also becomes a compliance issue to make sure it is built as it was specified. So you typically would have architectural plans that are certified as being 504 compliant on the multifamily units that are being developed, but somebody also needs to verify that. And I'll just kind of give you an example as a quick example of how important that is. I had a project that was completed. We were very proud. It was now fully occupied, brand new multifamily structure. And we got a call placing a complaint about 504, and we were very surprised because we had this new structure that was supposed to be compliant, and we went to. I looked at the drawings; it was all drawn to the spec with roll-in shower and accessible doors. When we went to the unit, there was an elderly gentleman in the living room in a hospital bed. His wife was caring for him. And when we went into the bathroom, instead of being a roll-in shower, as was specified in the plans that have been approved and certified, it had about a 5-inch lip. And so it was unusable for that household who desperately needed that assistance. And so because no one through that construction phase looked at those drawings and paid attention to what was required, we now had a fully occupied property that to fix that, we had to move this vulnerable gentleman out of the unit, blast out the flooring in that, and rebuild the bathroom. So somebody, it's great that you look at the front end, but somebody else has to pay attention on the back end of that.
Thank you so much. All right, so Section 504 when it comes to non-housing activity. CDBG funded facilities must be able to be approached, entered, and used by people with disabilities. So you want to look at your entrances and exits. A good example Les just gave us, meeting rooms, restrooms, water fountains, even is one that I've seen before. You want to ensure facilities that are used for public meetings and interaction with the public are accessible, or you want to go ahead and make accommodations to that. So you may need to relocate programs to accessible facilities or accessible portions of facilities. You may need to acquire or build new facilities that are accessible or alter those facilities. I also want to point out that state and local governments are subject to Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, the ADA Act, which also requires accessibility of newly constructed or altered streets, roads, highways, or pedestrian walkways. So that is something to remember as well. This also refers to or is triggered by newly constructed or altered streets, roads, highways, or pedestrian walkways. All right, Section 504, additional requirements for grantees with more than 15 employees. So this is about employee opportunity here. So the 504, there must be a 504 designated coordinator. This the agency must adopt 504 grievance procedures. Notify participants, beneficiaries, and employees of the non-discrimination policy if there are more than 15 employees. Ensure accessible design and construction. Conduct a self-evaluation. And again, there is that self-evaluation form in the handbook. And ensure non-discrimination in employment. I think everyone should be doing this, but certainly if you have 15 or more employees, there is a special caveat that you must do these things.
And I'll just note that for folks that are in this category, it may be that this is a countywide or citywide and being handled by, like your human resources office. So you may want to check as you're reading this and thinking, oh, we may have to handle this. It may be handled at a countywide or citywide basis.
Thank you so much. All right, so employment and contracting. Steps that can be taken to prevent discrimination in employment can include reviewing employment procedures and marketing materials to make sure they include that equal employment opportunity language and logos. Develop and maintain employment by race, ethnicity, and gender categories. Remember that local government workforce analysis form that I talked about a little bit earlier. Demonstrate reasonable accommodations for those on the job and in the workforce that need them. Um, this can include even very desks. I've seen those help a lot with people with back issues, but you want to make sure that you are offering reasonable accommodations. Advertise employment opportunities or recruit employees for project-related positions. Um, and yeah, that's it. That's all. That's my whole list. Develop and maintain employment data that includes the composition. Again, using that local workforce, government workforce analysis form, which again is also a good form to make sure that you're helping you meet your minority and women-owned business goals, and we call those MeBs. All right, complaints. Citizens may file complaints regarding discrimination. These should be handled, immediately. Informal resolution is encouraged if you can without litigation, and you should take a proactive approach. So compliance with requirements and documenting everything, documenting your compliance helps to avoid those. So complaints can be filed with the federal Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity Office, HUD's Fair Housing Equal Opportunity Office, um, and they will investigate the complaint and try to conciliate the matter with both parties. Complaints can also be filed through the Kentucky Commission on Human Rights or local human rights commission, um, and they can also be filed through DLG. Individuals may send a fair housing complaint to DLG within 180 days of the incident, simply telling DLG what happened. The grant administrator should work with the affected individual to resolve the complaint. And if that's not satisfactory to the individual, then the administrator should assist the individual in preparing the complaint and forwarding it to DLG. All right, and that is it. We've reached the end of the fair housing module. I don't see any questions in the Q&A or in the chat here.
I think
All
we're
right, Dr.
good.
Oh,
So we're obviously ahead of schedule here. I think what we'll go ahead and do is start on the relocation chapter and be able to then kind of take a much needed break in the middle of that for lunch, and then we'll be a little bit ahead of schedule on this, which is probably not a bad thing for folks. So I'm just going to put this in a little bit of context on what the next couple of topics that we are going to be covering. So chapter 8 is relocation. And so this is when, because of an action that is being taken as part of our funding, federal funding being put in a project, someone, whether it's an individual or a business, is being displaced. And so there are regulations that apply to how we're going to assist them and essentially protect them from the negative impact and the harm of that displacement. But we're going to then follow that with module 9, which is the acquisition. So, and a lot of times these go hand in hand. So you have to kind of think of them together in some projects. We might be, and I'll just throw out some examples. So we could be doing an economic development project where we were assisting a company. They were going to buy a property and build a new manufacturing facility. But let's say that there is a house on that property and there is a tenant occupying that structure. That tenant's going to be displaced when we, let's say in this case, we're going to knock the house down, clear that site, and build that structure. And so that tenant is going to be protected. So as part of our acquisition, we're not only covering the rules that apply to acquisition, but we're looking at that property to analyze, are we going to cause any potential displacement? And so we're doing those things at the same time, hand in hand. So we'll do a little bit of back and forth as we go through these next two modules on kind of how they relate to each other and the importance of being aware of both parts of this. So let's jump into the relocation aspect of this. So we have regulations in a number of topics and areas. So 24 CFR Part 570, and we said that 570 is where all of our CDBG regulations are, and this is at 606. In the CDBG regulations are essentially referencing and tying in the Uniform Relocation Act and Real Property Acquisition Act of, I think, 1970 as amended is the full name, but it's really just referred to as either Uniform Relocation Act, or in most cases, you'll see we're going to reference it as URA. In addition to that, we also have Section 104D. So this goes back a ways, but some of you may have heard over the years there was a representative in Massachusetts, Barney Frank, who saw in his local community, where housing was kind of a precious resource, affordable housing was difficult to find, that there were lots of projects that were funded with public dollars, particularly federal dollars, that were doing some kind of redevelopment, and they were taking affordable housing units and converting them to another use, or maybe knocking them down to make way for something else. And so as part of investing in one public good, we were eliminating another. So we were losing affordable housing. And so Section 104D works kind of hand in hand with URA, and we'll be talking about that. But it's specific to when we are eliminating a unit of affordable housing as part of our projects. And so we'll talk about that. And then you'll hear me talking about the HUD Handbook 1378. So if you are unlucky enough to have a project where it is involving relocation, then the HUD Handbook 1378 is where a lot of the guidance material is. It's where some of the sample forms that we're going to be referencing are found. And so it's an important resource that you might end up needing to be using in the future, depending on the types of projects that you were choosing to do. So the Uniform Relocation Act is to protect folks that were displaced from federally assisted projects. And my undergraduate degree was in history, so I always kind of think knowing that sort of background and why we have these regulations helps you kind of understand why they are written in a particular way. So the way we got the Uniform Relocation Act was that we had some really big federal initiatives. This is probably for a lot of you before your time, where we had the Urban Renewal Program. And so funding was being provided to communities who were trying to renew their urban spaces. In a lot of cases, they were buying out blighted sections of property and knocking everything down and doing some redevelopment. So for instance, in the little town that I grew up in, right in the southern part of the downtown, was an urban renewal project where they essentially cleared that entire area. They did build a new post office. There is one high-rise affordable senior housing project, but for the most part of that laid empty for a long time. Eventually, a new hotel and some parking happened in that area. But we had a lot of towns where a lot of purchase of property were done and people were displaced, and there weren't benefits particularly that were provided for those folks. A lot of folks were renters, but others were low-income owners that weren't necessarily compensated with enough to be able to find other housing. The other project that happened in that same sort of general period was our freeway system. So when all of our major freeways were being built really as part of a Cold War effort to be able to move missiles around, not really to move cars around, we had massive purchases of right away to run these freeways across the country. And in doing so, then there were a lot of folks who were forcibly bought out of their properties. And there was concern about not only were people displaced, but as we're going to be talking about under acquisition, there was concern whether people actually knew their rights when they were negotiating with the federal government, who was saying, I'm going to I'm going to purchase your property. We can either negotiate a sale price or I'll go through the court system with eminent domain. I'm simply going to take your property. So a concern about how the rights of those folks were handled and whether they understood what their rights were on that. So you'll see that as sort of the basic theme as we go through these two next sections, where we're trying to make sure that folks who are involved in an acquisition or a relocation that involves federal dollars understand what their rights are kind of fully informed about the details of this so that they can make informed decisions. And so a lot of importance on documenting that that has been done and that we can prove that keeping them informed and letting them know about their rights was done in a timely manner. So Section 104D, as I mentioned, is protecting the supply of affordable housing. And so there are two aspects of Section 104D. The first part of this is concerned about relocation. And so this is specifically under 104D is looking at only LMI tenants. So we'll be talking as we go through relocation, you'll see that URA covers everyone that is displaced. So if we had, let's say we had a downtown high rise that was mostly occupied by low-income individuals, but on the top floor we had a penthouse suite that was really lavish, and we had someone with a lot of wealth that was located there. When we empty that building, everyone in the building is going to be provided assistance. Now, whether the wealthy person on the top floor will actually need assistance to find another unit that's going to be affordable for them and comparable, they might not need assistance, but they are covered under the Uniform Relocation Act, whereas 104D is only looking at those LMI tenants within the building. And so for those LMI tenants in the building that we're talking about with the penthouse, everyone would be offered URA benefits and informed of their rights. In addition, those low-income tenants that live other than in the penthouse would also be informed about their rights under 104D. And then in actuality, they would be choosing, do I want to take URA benefits? Do I want to take Section 104D? So we'll talk about that as we go forward here. But the other half then of the Section 104D regulations, and this kind of goes back to that loss of affordable housing units based on these public investments, is that when we're eliminating LMI rental units or converting them to another use, that project will be required to then replace them. And so as part of our demonstrating compliance with 104D, either we would be demonstrating that we are eliminating some affordable units. Then we're going to have a plan that will show how we plan on replacing those units, or we would document that none of these units that we are eliminating are actually part of the affordable housing supply. Sometimes we see that we are doing demolition of essentially sort of the ruins of a structure that really aren't occupiable. And so we can at times demonstrate that these are not occupiable units. They couldn't, with a reasonable investment, be brought back into that affordable housing supply. And so they end up being exempt on this. I will mention, since some of you will be dealing with disaster assistance, that oftentimes with disaster assistance, one of the waivers that is put in place is this one-for-one replacement requirement. We also sometimes see for disaster waivers that they actually waive the 104D requirements and simply say, we're going to follow URA. You won't have to go through the process of looking at both of these and providing folks that. So when we get into a disaster situation, we could have some different rules on that that you would need to pay attention to. All right, so let's talk a little bit about definitions, and this becomes really important on this. So our definition of a displaced person, so this is somebody that's going to be eligible for assistance, is someone that moves as a direct result of that activity And that could be due to their property being acquired or rehabbed or demolished. And that includes households, businesses, and nonprofits. Now, the thing I'm going to mention here, and this is an important point to understand, um, is that we have to be able to show that either they are a displaced person, they've been notified, or be able to show that their displacement had nothing to do with this project. And I'll give you a kind of painful example with a community I'm working with in another state. So I'm working with a county that received money from the state to create a disaster relocation center. So they were acquiring this piece of land, building this facility. So in the event where we had communities, in this case, it was coastal communities that needed to be evacuated, that there would be this center where, this mass evacuation, people could be directed to that and be housed there temporarily. So they chose to, there was a county airport that was being shut down. And so they chose to allocate funding for this site at the county airport. And there were some individuals that were occupying some space around one of the hangars that was leased to someone, and they had moved in campers and they were living in those campers. As it turned out, those individuals were not on the part of the airport that actually was going to be redeveloped for this center, and they actually were evicted because of, based on the lease for that particular section, they weren't allowed to be there. But they are filing claims and saying we were displaced, we should have benefits. So having that paper trail to be able to show, we're going to be talking about these important notices that get sent out, is that we have notices that are sent out saying, okay, there's this project, you may be relocated here, your benefits, we're going to have you informed, but also being able to clearly draw that line and say, these folks, our project is here. These folks are not in that area. You are not impacted. You've been informed that you're not related to that, and have a paper trail then to show that. Will be very important on being able to demonstrate that, yeah, I'm in compliance, that if someone then comes forward with a filing, that you could say, no, I'm sorry, you're not eligible, and here's the basis for that. Also under our displacement definition, under our section 104D requirements, we said that this is limited to a lower income tenant, so at 80% or below, and they are displaced, and it's limited to based on a CDBG conversion or demolition. So obviously, demolition of their unit's pretty clear what we're talking about there and why they would be displaced. But we might convert those units to another use. So maybe they're going to be market rate units. They're no longer going to be affordable, or maybe we're changing these units into some specific usage, like a facility. Maybe it's going to become a treatment facility for folks dealing with drug addiction. Well, that changes, and so they have been displaced by this conversion of their unit to something else. And so they, under those definitions, would then be eligible for those benefits. All right. So some additional definitions on this when we talk about that as a direct result. If they are getting a notice to vacate, or it's been determined that as a direct result of that project, they are going to be eligible. But it also includes, and this is the important point here, if we fail to give them a notice that says, there's going to be a project, you will be able to stay here. You can occupy your unit. It's still going to be affordable for you. If we fail to give them that notice, then they can assume that they were going to be displaced. You're seeing, people on site looking at the building, looking at plans. You've heard about folks talking about, your building is going to be redeveloped, or it's been sold, or whatever is happening. If we don't give them a notice, and there are federal dollars involved in that, they are considered to be displaced, and they are eligible for those notices, even though you never would have displaced them. So when we begin to talk about giving notices like the general information notice, getting those out in a timely manner can make the difference between we suddenly are making payments to households that never would have been eligible for those. Also, if we don't, at the end of our project, leave them in a decent, safe, and sanitary unit, that's what DSS stands for, then they would be considered displaced or unreasonable terms. So it's no longer affordable for them, or we have placed them, maybe it's a family of 5, and we have kept them on the property, but we've now moved them from a 3-bedroom unit to a 1-bedroom unit. That's not going to be reasonable for them to be able to occupy, and so they would be considered to be displaced. And then this last bullet point where I talk about changing the residential business character, I think the changing this to a treatment facility for drug addiction would be a good example of that. And so even if, let's say Andelin lived in this structure, even if we left her in place and said, well, you're not going to have to move, but as each of the tenants over time moved out and we moved in one of our clients who was part of our treatment program, we've changed that character of the building. And so she would have a right to be able to say, I have been displaced because of this change and I should be offered benefits. And HUD is going to say, she is absolutely right. You need to make sure that that is handled. All right. So let's then talk about people that are not displaced. So in some cases, and I've seen quite a number of these, we will have maybe an abandoned building where we have folks that have moved into that building. They have no legal right to occupy that structure, but they simply have moved themselves in. They would not be eligible, they would not be considered to be someone that has been displaced, except, and here's kind of think about most of these regulations are really geared toward protecting the person who has been harmed by the project. And when in doubt, we're going to take their side. So if they didn't get a notice, we're going to assume, yes, they were eligible for this. And even in the case where we have someone who is a squatter on the property, doesn't have a legal right to be there, if they've been there for a while, and the owner of that structure has never taken any action. But now, because we have federal dollars that have been included in this project, now want to say, oh, well, they aren't legally occupying. They are now being displaced as a result of this project because you chose not to take any action before. So we still could have folks that are not legal occupants, but need to be covered based on what we then learn about this. Also, if we have someone that's evicted for good cause, so they stop paying their rent or they act out in some way that's in violation of their lease, they're not going to be covered. We also will have, if there are people that move into that project and have been provided a notice. So there is in the sample notices, there's what we call a move-in notice. So you could say to a person, we have the potential of this project. And so you want to rent this unit, we're going to issue this move-in notice that says there is a potential of this future project receiving funding. If that happens, you could be displaced by this project. And because we told you in advance, you're not going to be eligible for that. And so having that notice in place is the key thing here. This, you'll notice it says, and was provided a notice. So it's only with that documentation that they're exempt. Sort of related to this is occupied to obtain benefits. If we could show that in some way this was manipulated, that they were able to do that, they were there for the purpose, they had some knowledge in advance, then we could potentially exclude them as not being displaced. In some cases, we'll have an acquisition that happens and these folks will retain a life estate. So they may not own it anymore, but they have a legal right to be able to occupy that property throughout the rest of their life. They are not displaced because we have this well-documented legal right to be there. In other cases that don't kind of cleanly fit here, you're going to need to work with DLG. DLG at times will want to work with HUD on this to make sure that HUD will agree that yes, these people are not displaced and they're not eligible for any benefits. So the key you'll hear me kind of talking about in this section is as you look at a potential project, before you make a decision to do that project, you're going to want to assess, what do I know about the property? Is it occupied? Are they going to be displaced by this project? And so thinking about, our budget's going to need to include these benefits. We're going to have notices to deliver. We're going to have some obligation here that would need to be part of that. So kind of planning for that project. I'll give you kind of a worst case scenario. I worked with a project, former high-rise hotel in downtown Atlanta that had become affordable housing. And it was sort of a mix of market rate housing and affordable. So we had a lot of folks who were were at income less than 30% of area median income, and they were receiving a project-based voucher that was paying much of their rent for them. Intermixed in that same building, we had units that had been rented to, there was a group of Delta pilots that had rented apartments in this building. And so when they were on overnight layovers or there for a few days, they were occupying these units. So we had a mix on that. And so in pre-planning for that project, and the recognition was that the elevators in this building would have to be removed and replaced, and so was plumbing and HVAC. And so folks we're going to need to empty the building. They would need to be gone for more than a year. And so everyone would be displaced. Then calculating what's the cost of that going to be. And in particular, we had a lot of folks that their rent was made affordable based on this project-based voucher. So when we moved them somewhere else, it wouldn't travel with them. So as part of that pre-planning, we calculated the numbers and came up with a relocation budget of, I believe it was $1.4 million. So for that project to move forward, that needed to be included in the budget. That's a huge chunk of money, along with thinking about staffing and notices and all of that. So initially, that project was not viable because there wasn't the money to be able to do that. Folks around the table decided it was important enough. They got the project-based vouchers converted to individual vouchers that could go with those tenants that were being moved. And the money was put in place as part of that so this project could go forward. So you don't want to accidentally wander into URA. You need to have assessed that on the front end and then include that as part of your planning, as part of your budget, thinking about staffing. All right. Also, things that would qualify as not being, as a result of the project. If we had code enforcement that was not part of that project, if they were notified that they weren't going to be displaced and they tried to claim that. What we also see, and this is an important thing to know, and this would be important if you were someone that was doing rehab under regular CDBG, or if under disaster programs you were doing some rehabilitation. If we have an owner occupant and they are voluntarily signing up for your assistance, URA is not triggered because they are voluntarily part of this. So all these regulations about what you must provide that owner occupant do not apply here. Now, to be able to rehab that person's house, you may need them out of that property. And so some programs will say, okay, you will temporarily have to be out of your unit. We're not providing any benefits, and you will have to find another place to live with friends or family while we're doing this. That's one option. Or it would be allowable with CDBG funds to do what we call an optional relocation. And design and set aside some funds so that during the time that we need that owner or occupant to be out of that unit, we could provide them some assistance. It's not URA, it's what we call optional relocation. So just keep that in mind. And then lastly, if we have a person who is not a legal resident of the US, they are called out in URA benefits language. They are excluded from receiving any URA benefits. So there was a question that just popped up about, can we go back to a retained life estate? Sure. When we talked about not displaced, when we have an acquisition, one possible type of acquisition is where, as part of that real estate transaction, we purchase the property, but we give them or grant them in, as part of a legal document, give them a life estate. So, maybe there's let's use the example, there's kind of an important building in the town that we want to own. Let's say I'm purchasing it for some kind of redevelopment, but the owner, maybe we have an elderly owner that is saying, I want to live the rest of my life here. You could, as part of that negotiation, say, okay, we're going to purchase the property, but as part of this deal, we're going to provide you a life estate. And that would mean that as long as you're alive, you can occupy that unit. But as soon as you die, since the ownership is already transferred, then they have the right to be able to take that property. None of your relatives could then say, well, that was my grandmother's house. That life estate is specific to that individual. We don't see that a great deal, but that is something that we sometimes see done. And so just recognize that that person still has that legal right to occupy, and so they can't claim that they are displaced as part of that. All right. So some key terms. Yes, Andelin.
Hi, we had a question in the chat. Can you go back to what a retained life estate is?
Yeah, that's what I just covered.
Oh, I apologize.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. So when we talk about some additional definitions, and the reason we're bringing this up because timing is really important on this. So you'll hear me use the term initiation of negotiation. So really, at the initiation of negotiations, when we say to that property owner, we want to purchase your property, that triggers the benefits under relocation. And this is one of those places where that connection between folks that are acquiring the property versus who lives there in relocation. So if we are going to make an offer on the property or initiate negotiations for the purchase of the property, that would be the triggering point that anyone, let's say we have tenants in this unit, at the point we trigger those negotiations, that initiation negotiation, that triggers benefit eligibility for that individual. So let's say we have the economic development project, they're buying the house and the property that has the tenants in it. At the point we trigger the initiation of negotiation, they are immediately eligible for relocation. So we want simultaneously to be able to provide them a general information notice that we'll be talking about, saying, there's a potential of property, of a project happening, don't move, you may be eligible for benefits, or we could be issuing them a benefit letter and saying, you are going to be displaced, and we'll walk through that process. So that triggering, the people handling the acquisition also need to be aware of, is there a potential for relocation? I need to coordinate my efforts on that so I make sure that notices happen at the same time. Otherwise, let's say I am the tenant in that house and negotiations are initiated for this. I haven't been given any kind of a notice. I can move out. I can rent the penthouse apartment for $4,000 a month. And because I am going to be considered displaced because I didn't get a notice, I didn't get an eligibility letter on this, my URA benefits are going to be based on making that unit you selected as to make that affordable. Had I given them a notice, I would have established some comparable units and said, the maximum benefit you can get is to make a unit that, there are available units in your community that are comparable. Their rent would be, $800 a month, and that's the maximum rent that we are going to subsidize for you. So failure to coordinate those can be really pretty important. And so, it's that upfront analysis on what are my risks, what are the steps that needed to be done, and that's for an activity or a series of activities that are funded with CDBG. All right, so talking about kind of the planning on this, first thing we want to do is have some policies and procedures in place. In this case, we have, with the chapters that have been developed in the handbook, you've got a good framework, but typically a funder is going to say, okay, you're coming to us applying for a project that would involve potential displacement. We want a plan in place specific for that property. So, that might be saying, look, we, at the end of this project, all those units are going to still be affordable. They're going to be brought up to standards. We have some empty units. We're going to shift folks around. So we'll rehab the vacant units, move a few folks over, rehab their units, and keep shifting around so no one will be displaced. Or maybe my plan is I'm going to temporarily move folks out. I'm going to get this done in less than 12 months. I'm going to move them back. So having a plan in place with policies and procedures would be part of that process to plan for that project. Make sure you would budget it appropriately. At the point that you would be applying for assistance to DLG, we need to make sure that that general information notice, the GIN notice, this would be this is one of the key steps here. So at the point that that application goes to DLG, which is demonstrating that I have an intent to use federal dollars on this project, that's a triggering point. We need to make sure that general information notice, the GIN notice, has been issued. So that should come in with the application. So timing on that GIN notice is really important, and know that it's tied with the application for funding. We're going to be talking then about relocation advisory services at the point we've actually triggered URA, working with each of those households to figure out what their needs are, other elements that might impact their ability to find other housing. We might be providing them other services. And then as part of our process, we're going to be analyzing where are there comparable replacement units. We can only place people in decent, safe, and sanitary units that are also lead safe, and they would be functionally equivalent to current units. So I'll give you an example. In the little town that I lived in for a while, there was a large redevelopment that happened in the downtown area. There was a whole group of really derelict single-family houses that were rental properties that were going to be knocked down, and they were building very nice multi-family units and some single-family homes in that area. Big improvement for the area. And so these individuals were going to be displaced. And so we had to go through that process on determining what their benefits would be. And so the first step was identifying comparable replacement units. So the assumption on the front end was this is going to cost a lot of money because they're living in horrible units. We can't put them in we can't find, congratulations, we found another horrible unit for you and we're going to help you to move there. They have to be moved to a decent, safe, and sanitary unit that's also lead safe. As it turned out, these folks were living in these units and paying pretty much a market rate for what they would have paid for a decent unit in the community. So they identified that there are other units available, they're decent, safe, and sanitary, and lead safe, and they're renting for the same amount as this horrible unit that you are renting, or maybe slightly more than that in some cases. And so by identifying those comparable replacement units, that's what's going to be used to set the amount of assistance that needs to be provided for each one of those individuals. And so that's that basis of figuring out, how am I going to budget for this? How do I define in my benefit letter to that household what's the most that we're going to provide for you as part of that? And then by identifying those replacement units, we're also assisting those folks in at least starting the process of identifying where they might move to in their community. So they don't have to be exactly the same size, but functionally equivalent. So, maybe you had an individual single person who was living in a 3-bedroom unit. It will function equivalently for them to be in a smaller unit. And so we would look at who was occupying that unit and how it functioned. So once we've identified those comparable units, we're able to select one of those as being sort of our most comparable. And then based on that available unit, we will make a calculation of, to have that unit be affordable, do we need to subsidize this for this household, or can they actually afford it? And we'll look at those calculation process in a little bit on that. So at the point we've gone through that process, we then need to send out either a notice saying, hey, you're not going to be displaced. So at the end of this project, you can occupy your unit or another unit on the property that is functionally equivalent. It's going to be affordable. It's going to be decent, safe, and sanitary for you. Or that you're going to be one of the households that will be displaced. Here are the relocation assistance that's you're eligible for. So that includes not only the HUD brochures, which explain about what their rights are. We want to make sure they're fully informed, but it also provides this estimate of the replacement housing payment. So we've figured out a comparable unit. Let's say this household is paying $800 a month in rent, and the most comparable unit is going to be $1,000. And so we're going to be subsidizing that gap in affordability. And so our replacement housing estimate will show them that, here are comparable units. Here's the amount of subsidy that we're going to be providing. With that, or at a later date, we would be giving them a 90-day notice. We might be then following it with a 60-day and a 30-day notice, but we'll give them adequate notice about vacating that property, and then we're going to be paying those moving expenses that are related to that. So, that's kind of our basic process on this. So at the point that the application is being submitted, we need to have policies and procedures in place. Those GIN notices, general information notices, need to be issued to all of the occupants of that property. And that's when we begin that process under advisory services to meet with those individual households, interview them, figure out what their housing needs would be. That might include, let's say we have someone who occupies a ground floor accessible unit. So we need to work with them to identify another appropriate accessible unit for them, and that would be part of our advisory services to figure out what are their needs on that, identifying the comparables, and be ready then at the point we initiate negotiations to be able to provide them a notice of eligibility, which would include our replacement housing payment estimate, or a notice of non-displacement, and let them know that you're going to be able to occupy this, it'll be affordable, all of that. And then at the point we're ready for them to move out, which might be right away, we're going to issue that 90-day notice along with their benefit letter. Or maybe we know construction isn't going to happen for a while, they can stay for a while, so we wait for when we're going to issue those notices. At the end of the project, where everyone has been moved, all of the benefits have been paid, we're going to have a very complete file that will be able to demonstrate that we provided all of the required notices, that we worked with those households. We can document this whole process, including we can show where they moved to, that we've inspected that unit, the replacement unit, to know that they are now occupying an affordable, decent, safe, and sanitary, lead safe unit. All of our payments have been made, and then only then would we be able to close that out. So a lot of files, a lot of planning on this as part of that. That can be a large undertaking, or for some of our larger projects, or it might be something small. But I think the key here is planning ahead, knowing what you're getting into, and that might be a decision point of, do I want to do this project? I'll give you another example. We had an application when I was at the state, and early on, I was the URA specialist for the state. And a nonprofit was purchasing, they were going to create some housing units. And there was a old motel that they had been told by the owner of the property was unoccupied. So they went out to look at the property, to inspect it, and as they were on site, there were doors opening and people coming out of those units. They determined that this is clearly not an unoccupied unit. Unclear whether the owner is aware of that, simply not disclosing that, and they chose to not get involved in that property because of that issue. I did another project, which was a building in a downtown area that had a restaurant in the ground floor. I think at one point historically had been a YWCA, and we were told that no one occupied that structure. We found then that some of the staff who worked in the restaurant were actually living upstairs. That was a little unclear whether that was known by the owner, but then we also discovered that there were people coming in and out of the fire escape, that there were people that had been long-term occupants of some of those upper floor rooms. And again, that was one that to be able to consider funding that project, there would have to be more information about who actually occupies those units, defining who was going to be defined as displaced or non-displaced, and calculating what would the budget be for that. And in that case, the city that was considering doing that project, there was not adequate money on the table to be able to do this in compliance, and the owner of the structure wasn't even willing to acknowledge who lived there, let alone contribute to those costs related to that. So again, it was a project that they chose not to go forward with. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the policies and procedures on this. So I've been talking a lot about budget. So, you can imagine as a grant administrator, you don't want to start on something and then find that you've got costs that are not anywhere planned for this. To be able to call up Travis or Jennifer, someone, Gabe, and say, hey, I'm going to need more money because it turns out I've got an occupied property and these folks are going to need URA benefits. That's not going to go well. You have, as part of your funding agreement, and acknowledgement by the community that you are responsible for cost overruns on this. You are being asked on the front end to identify if you have an occupied property. So it's something that you need to have planned for as part of that. So thinking about where the costs going to be, will they be public or private funds, and then trying to figure out, is this a project that's going to be feasible for us to do, or might we not want to approach that? And that may include some coordination with other folks. So, in the high-rise example, they were able to work with the Public Housing Agency and get the project-based benefits switched into vouchers to make that project possible. So, planning, working with other folks on this. And that also, kind of the worst case scenario sometimes are businesses. So maybe we're doing a downtown redevelopment. on a structure that is occupied by some small businesses, if they are going to be displaced by this, that can be expensive and complicated. And there is also an option under business relocation. We might have a business that's really not viable. They could still get benefits as a going out of business URA benefit. So planning, knowing what's involved becomes really important. We have a question that came up. If it's determined that residents would need to be temporarily moved to another unit after already given a notice of non-displacement, what is the timeline for the notice? So the notice of non-displacement is saying to them that at the end of the project, you will be able to be in on this property in a comparable unit. It's going to be affordable. We're not changing the the character of that property. But that notice of non-displacement does not say that they won't be temporarily relocated. It does say that if you were required to be temporarily relocated, that there would be benefits that would be provided. So you're not in violation of that notice that you've already issued. I would want to know as much as possible, are we going to have to move folks temporarily? Sometimes that temporary relocation might be on the property and we're simply shifting folks around to other units. Other times, based on the work that we're doing and their configuration of the property, we can move them temporarily for up to 12 months. If it goes beyond 12 months, they're considered to be permanently displaced, and we have to provide them the full benefits under URA. But up to 12 months, we can do that. So that's part of that planning on, maybe the overall rehab was going to take longer than 12 months, but we can shift people around. So no one can be displaced more than 12 months on that. All right. So under the policies and procedures, we've been talking about this relocation plan, figuring out who can stay, who can go, who might need to be temporarily displaced, a plan and strategy for that. And sometimes that can be something complicated. I'll give you an example. I worked on funding a tax credit project in home that was for another YWCA. I had a period where YMCAs and YWCAs were getting funding. And one of the floors of this structure was being used as a drug treatment center. And so as part of that treatment, folks they were in a congregate setting and receiving, counseling that was happening, I think probably on a daily basis. So they needed another site where they could relocate that whole group to sort of a similar setting. So that planning for the temporary relocation was really key. And in fact, in that case, they actually rented some vacant units where there were a bunch of them in a complex and kept them vacant, paid to keep them vacant for a while until they were ready to actually temporarily move folks, because that need for temporary housing was going to be really difficult to be able to do. And I will mention when we get into if you're dealing in an area that has been impacted by a disaster. So you've had a tornado that's damaged a large portion of housing, or where we've had flooding. Being able to find temporary relocation units can be really difficult, because particularly if we're in a non-urban area, there may not be a lot of housing to begin with. It was fully occupied before the disaster, and now some of those units aren't usable. And so that temporary relocation planning can be really critical as part of that. This third bullet here under plans, talking about optional relocation plan, that's when I mentioned about if we have voluntary participants in a rehab program and we're going to provide some benefits to help them be somewhere else. So for instance, your optional relocation plan might be saying we will pay up to a certain dollar amount per night for you to occupy a motel or hotel in the area, one that we've inspected to make sure it's decent, safe, and sanitary and would be lead safe. So, if we can find a motel or hotel that was built in 1978 or more recently, we're going to know that it's going to be lead free, should be lead free. And then we might, because we're putting them in a motel room where they don't have a kitchen, we might be providing them meal vouchers. So our optional relocation plan might, set limits for how many nights, what the maximum amount was, what the maximum was for those meal vouchers on that. I have had communities that had someone, they moved to a motel. It had, central air. It had cable. They were having meal vouchers, so they weren't cooking. And we had folks that were like, I am not leaving. I don't care that you're telling me that my house is ready. So some specifics in that relocation plan about how long those benefits will last might be important on that. And then, as we mentioned, if you were eliminating affordable housing units through either demolition or conversion, this plan for a one-for-one replacement would be something that would need to be in place, and those would be reviewed by DLG. So they're wanting to make sure, do we have a plan? Do we have a budget? Have we identified staffing? That plan would identify, we know that the GIN notice, which is already out, needs to then be followed by these steps and actions that we talked about. So that plan would lay all that out so that not only do you have a plan of action, but DLG can see that, yeah, you understand what those steps are, what those requirements are as part of that. So that planning and budgeting, pretty important on that. So we'll do a couple more things here, and then let's take a much needed break for lunch. So advisory services and notices. So essentially everyone in that project is going to receive the general information notice, and they would either receive then a non-displacement or a benefit notice. And with that, both the owners and the tenants, we would be providing advisory services. So we'd be interviewing them, figuring out what their needs were for both displaced and non-displaced. And then, some of those special circumstances I mentioned, things like accessibility for someone that had some special needs for the unit that they were going to be living in. We oftentimes have, for both permanent and temporary relocation, have issues about, I have 5 dogs. And so I need a relocation somewhere where I can have those animals. Temporary relocation might involve, I had a household in New Jersey recently that had bunnies, and they were going to be in a hotel for I think 2 nights. Bunnies couldn't stay in the hotel, and so we were paying for boarding at a vet who would board those animals for those couple of days. So thinking about what are all the circumstances on this and planning ahead of that. This last bullet point about combining notices is referring to, so I mentioned, we're going to provide that notice of eligibility. And when we need them to move, we would be also issuing the move out notice. We're required to give them at least 90 days. You could do that at the same time you gave them the benefit letter, or you might be saying, we'll let you know when it's time that you need to move. You're eligible to move. If you want to go now, that's fine. But we'll give you a 90-day notice when that's in place. Similarly, if at the point that you give the general information notice, you know that folks will not be displaced if that project goes forward, you could go ahead and issue those notices also. One of the things that you will find with projects is that word of mouth and the rumor mill is sometimes a lot faster than you might be on that. And it's important to control getting good information out there to control those issues. All right, let's see. Got rid of that one. All right, so I think this might be a good stopping point before we go into the notices. So I have that it's 11:47. We can give you a little, since we're ahead of schedule here, we can give you a little bit longer on lunch. If we can be back at 1:15, we will jump in and finish up relocation. We're still going to be, I think, ahead of pace. And we'll do our relocation and acquisition this afternoon. So thanks everybody. Be back at 1:15 right on time and we'll get going with that.